Hi, I'm Yulia, and this is Burning Questions. The topic that set the internet on fire this week is what the hell is going on with Pavel Durov's arrest and why is it so controversial? And we're going to attempt to answer this question with our guest today, who is well known on the internet as Operator Starsky. He is a Ukrainian veteran. He's also the founder of the Propaganda Study Institute, and I'm sure you have seen him. Hi there. Why don't you introduce yourself a little better than I did so people know, so people know a little more about you?
Hello, nice to see you again. My name is Andrei Kulish, also known as Operator Starsky. I have a blog dedicated to amazing international community supporting Ukraine, and what I do is mostly reporting about the situation in Ukraine, around Ukraine, and debunking Russian disinformation.
And as I said earlier, you're also the founder of the Propaganda Study Institute. Can you tell us a little more about that?
So we decided to make this small organization with my colleagues from Ukraine. We have journalists, psychologists in our team in order to understand how exactly Russian propaganda and Russian disinformation works, why it's so effective, and find ways to expose it and fight it effectively, specifically around Europe, not only in Ukraine. In Ukraine, we have broad experience in fighting Russian propaganda, but unfortunately today this informational warfare is being waged on the West as well. And our task is not only to secure Ukrainian informational space and protect our citizens from Russian disinformation, but also help our friends from other countries fight it.
That's a great initiative, honestly. I wish that, I wish there were more institutes for the study of propaganda that were also founded in the West and had, Ukrainians assisting in understanding this propaganda, because honestly, it's such a big problem. And as we've figured out with this war, it seems like the West has zero clue how to fight it, how to identify it, and what to do with it, because they keep falling for, I guess, what seems to Ukrainians as the easiest, most obvious provocations and the most obvious Russian propaganda that in the West seems to be something that people have a very hard time figuring out. So I guess this is a very good seg into talking about Pavel Durov and why his arrest seems to be so controversial, where on one side of the equation we have Elon Musk and, Kim.com and all of the other definitely not Russian propagandists defending him and saying that, arresting him in France is encroaching in the freedom of speech and, a political witch hunt. And then we have experts on the other side saying, well, it is very evident that Telegram is a tool to spread Russian propaganda worldwide and is a very, very big tool that aids Russian disinfo operations and the invasion. So which side of this equation are you on?
One thing people must understand is the reason why Pavel Durov was arrested, and the biggest reason he was arrested was because he refused to cooperate with the authorities that were investigating crimes conducted through Telegram or using Telegram. As a former policeman, I would really, really like people to understand one simple fact. It's the key to people's freedom is people's safety, because when we are free, we are safe. We are safe to do what we like. And people who don't understand this simple fact, they sometimes find themselves really confused when they find out that their children buy drugs using Telegram, or, for example, those children emerge on some particular photos or videos. And we also must understand that freedom of speech that we all advocate for, that we are protecting, freedom of speech has absolutely nothing in common with freedom of hate speech, with freedom of crime, freedom of terrorism, freedom of child pornography, and things like that. This is why we are fighting for freedom for people's freedoms, and this is exactly why we are also fighting for safety. And that was reason number one why Pavel Durov was detained in France. And as for Russians, for example, and Russian propagandists that protect Durov right now, protect, I take it in quotes, they are not fighting for freedom of speech whatsoever. Like, it's even funny to consider that Russia even has freedom of speech. We all know that it's not so. Several reasons. Reason number one is that Russian military use Telegram. Telegram provides good protection of data. They also want to gain control over their own military correspondence, so-called, because in Russia, there are quite a few Russian terrorists who use Telegram to report about the situation on the ground. And sometimes they report things that do not correlate with official Kremlin's agenda. They report real Russian losses, real casualties among the Russian personnel and things like that. And also they criticize command in some particular cases. That's why Russia doesn't want them to be free. Again, they're not fighting for freedom of speech. The reason they want Durov to be released is to find ways to influence Durov, to find access to Telegram, and gain control over their own so-called war correspondence that they don't control. And they also want to secure their own data that is stored on Telegram, that is shared on Telegram, which is sensitive data. And again, if, for example, Durov starts cooperating with French authorities, it automatically means that Russian terrorist activities will also be exposed or used against Russians. So this is currently Russia's biggest concern. As for other people advocating for freedom of speech, I 100% support them. And again, freedom is safety. Freedom equals safety, and we should think about it.
Well, freedom of speech also does not grant you freedom from responsibility over that speech, right? And I think that a lot of people forget that little part, because you still have to face consequences over hate speech, over free speech that I guess here's the difference, right? If you're saying something freely and it does not hurt or harm anyone, that's okay. But if you choose to say something and do something freely and it does harm someone else, and it's now your responsibility that you have caused this to another person, then you're going to have to face the consequences. Yes, sure, you were free to do what you wanted, but now the government is free to impose the law on that, right? Well, there is this other thing that I actually am very interested in discussing with you, is that there are two camps again. One camp is thinking that Pavel Durov is this renegade, right, who left Russia because in 2014 he refused to surrender the information of Ukrainians that would aid the Russian invasion. And then there is this other camp who is like, well, but how is Telegram still allowed to operate in Russia to begin with? Because, you know, Viber is blocked, WhatsApp is blocked, Signal is blocked, Facebook is blocked, and I can continue going because there's so many social media networks that are just not allowed. And yet this one is allowed, and the military uses it, and the leadership uses it, and everybody uses it, but you know, it's owned by this man who's supposedly persona non grata in Russia. So I personally am in the camp of people who doesn't think that Pavel Durov is a renegade. I do think that he aids and abets the government, and I do think that Telegram is a very useful tool for Russians to spread misinformation abroad, and likely him, fleeing Russia because he refused to surrender this or that information is just a cover-up story. So I wonder what you think about it.
I support you 100%. The reason Russians still use Telegram is because Telegram is also used by Ukrainians, and it's one of the most popular platforms that are used by Eastern communities, Western communities. And this is where they can introduce their PsyOps. This is where they can make copies of legit Telegram channels, like Ukrainian monitoring channels, and spread their propaganda there, where there are basically many cases every single day of Russians creating fake Telegram channels like Bakhmutsky Demon reporting from the ground, a lot of military, a lot of press and journalists are subscribed to this channel, Show na Fronti, etc., etc. So many Telegram channels that provide legit information from the ground, they are being copied, and Russians create those fake accounts to spread their disinformation, basically. Another thing is that they often scam people. For example, they're fundraisers for the Ukrainian army or Ukrainian civilians, fundraisers to provide humanitarian aid to Ukraine. And Russians also, there were many cases when Russians would create fake Telegram channels with similar graphics, similar content, similar names, and they will literally steal money. So again, this is very important. Russians don't advocate for freedom of speech regarding Telegram. They want control, and they want to introduce whatever the terrorists do.
Yeah, I think that they're more scared that Telegram is going to be banned in Europe now that Pavel Durov is arrested, because realistically there is no precedent for Europe and other Western countries Europe is not a country, but other Western nations or alliances to ban Telegram until there is testimony from Pavel Durov that is going to give them enough reason to do so, right? Because realistically this arrest is probably also meant specifically for that. I'm also, I use Telegram. I don't use it for any secure communications or any communications with soldiers, but obviously to read the news. And one of the things that really scares me, for instance, is I'm sure you're aware of this channel, but there is a channel called Merk that basically doxes Ukrainian foreign fighters and provides information of their family members, their wives, their children, where they're from, links to all of their social media. And on any network, for instance, like Facebook, right, that would have been flagged and that would have been taken down because it's doxing. Anywhere on the internet, virtually, Google will not, route you anywhere like that because that is illegal. It's illegal to dox people. However, Telegram is okay. And I am kind of segging this to the topic of Twitter, because it used to be so that if you were to post a very gory video, for instance, let's say, and that's not something I would ever want to mention, but in this scenario, I think it's applicable, but the video of the dismemberment of the Ukrainian servicemen that was posted on Telegram a little while ago, it also immediately started going viral on Twitter. Something like that would have never been allowed on Instagram or on Facebook or on TikTok or on YouTube, for instance. Like, you would get demonetized. You would probably get banned for posting a dismembered human being in a video of that happening. And it used to be so that it was only Telegram. People would have this thing in their bio where like, oh, I can't post this here, but if you want to see the full thing, go to my Telegram channel. And now it's both Twitter, X, and Telegram. So that leads me to Elon Musk buying Twitter and it coming out a couple of days ago that no other than 2 Russian oligarchs were involved in sponsoring that purchase. And Twitter is becoming closer and closer to Telegram and resembles, the misinformation spreading patterns more and more. What do you think is the biggest sort of danger of not enforcing these rules and regulations onto these social networks? And do you see any links between Twitter and Telegram and how they're both used as a massive propaganda tool in Russia's favor?
Yeah, absolutely. The biggest threat that I can see as a communication specialist is, of course, Russian disinformation, because Russian disinformation is a combat weapon. The informational operations developed by Russians, they are utilized by Russian military personnel. The people who do PsyOps is a part of any army. It's an element of the armed forces. in any given country. Everybody who ever served knows that. That's why one of the biggest problems is, of course, the threat that Russians will keep destroying democratic society from within. They will keep pushing and promoting extremist movements, far left, far right extremist movements that will eventually gain power. And any intelligence expert will tell you that all the far left and far right movements in Europe and the United States, for example, they're controlled by Kremlin. It's not a secret. And as for connection between Telegram and X, well, again, it was exposed several days that there is a Russian connection with acquisition of Twitter, currently known as X, unfortunately. Not only Russians, actually a lot of shady figures helped Musk to acquire this platform. There was this American rapper, hip-hopper, who was accused of rape and other shady people. But generally, the biggest problem is that Russia found its access to most popular platforms, some of the most used on the West. And of course, we have to find ways to protect people from Russian disinformation, which is again military tool, military weapon. I don't think that it's necessary to ban Telegram. It's not necessary. There are ways when, and this is a good practice with other platforms, when developers cooperate with authorities and when there's cases discovered of crimes, sharing illegal content or selling illegal stuff, drugs, weapons, and things like that. Of course, developers can cooperate with the authorities and help them find criminals and punish them, which is a proper thing to do. And this is one of the ways we can literally save people, enforce and ensure that they are safe, that they are secure, they can be free.
Well, for sure. But I mean, it's hard to do when someone like Pavel Durov, who owns Telegram, right, and Elon Musk, who owns Twitter, who also has lawsuits in, I believe, Ireland and other EU countries where they wanted to, where the question of banning Twitter had arisen because they don't want to enforce these regulations and these rules, and they don't want to monitor content. They don't want to regulate content. I mean, also in the case of Twitter specifically, it seems like, well, first of all, for all of the naysayers who think that, Elon Musk is such a free speech epitome and he bought Twitter because he wanted it to be, accessible to everyone. The Russians that have sponsored the purchase of Twitter are not making any money on Twitter. Twitter right now is a money pit, and they're in fact losing a lot of money. So if that should tell you anything, that should tell you a lot. So that should really give our viewers and anybody who's listening to this sort of a perspective on how this free speech is being used. And then in the case of Telegram, what if Pavel Durov refuses to cooperate with the authorities and refuses to make those changes that are asked of him? What do you think is going to be the next steps? Because I think one of the biggest questions right now is what's going to happen with Durov and what's going to happen with Telegram, and sort of what is Europe going to do next?
Well, it's a good question. Again, if developers of some particular platform don't want to comply with the regulations, they don't want to cooperate with the authorities in order to ensure people's safety, then apparently such platform should not exist. That is obvious. And again, it's not about freedom of speech. It's not about freedom of thought. It's about freedom of crime. It's about freedom of terrorism and things like that. Elon Musk, I see a lot of commentaries that basically defend Musk in some very, very cringy ways. Sometimes people say we have freedom to be fooled. Which is something I have never heard before, but it sounds really interesting. There are people saying that we don't believe that Russians were involved because Musk is rich enough to buy whatever platform he wants. Yet he was ordered by the federal judge to publish the documents of all the shareholders, which basically confirms that indeed he borrowed the money from other investors. It's a fact. If he was rich enough to buy it, he would not need to have so many shareholders he took money from, right? So that's a really cringy situation. As for Durov's future, I believe that French authorities will do everything according to law, and I think that they will find a proper way to respond, because again, what happens now, and specifically in France, a lot of people don't like it, of course, but on the other hand, it's a proper thing when government finally starts fighting propaganda. Currently, Russian misinformation is fought by numerous voluntary organizations, by numerous all-saint groups and things like that, but they're not funded by government. And on the other hand, the Russian propaganda is pushed by Russian government. It's basically part of the Kremlin's machine. This is why European countries and American countries, they also have to find a proper way to respond.
Well, I mean, to be honest, and I'm sure you know this, as someone who works in this every day. I mean, I work in it every day, right? But on a bit of a different level than you do. And it baffles me how absolutely inadequately the West is fighting Russian propaganda, right? It seems like the only OSINT communities and people that are actually doing something and exposing the reality of what's going on are Ukrainians, which I mean is also not uncanny because we had a lot more experience with this and we've lived in it ourselves for much longer. But it's quite crazy because I think that people in the West just simply don't realize the scope of Russian propaganda, because when we say Russian propaganda, right, most people think like, oh, maybe an article or two, or maybe, those like stupid trolls that we see on YouTube and TikTok that are very obvious because their usernames are like American Eagle Texas 28, like who's going to call themselves that? Which real person is going to choose that as a username? But I think that what people don't realize is that this Russian propaganda network is a massive warfare tool as big as like an army, and the budgetary sort of involvement of spreading and creating this propaganda is probably bigger than most countries' GDP a year, right? So Russia doesn't only employ journalists and articles. It's like they're sleeper agents all over Europe and all over the North America and Latin America and really everywhere else. They're also, when we think of institutes of Russian studies at Cornell or at Dartmouth or at other colleges, those professors are also not there to teach you the Russian language. Those professors are there to, not all of them, but a lot of them are there to gather information and to also put out certain narratives. When we think about journalists at major publications like the Washington Post or the New Yorker or the New York Times, when we see those articles and someone, let's call them a John Smith in the US, is like, oh my God, why are they publishing this Russian propaganda? It's, well, what do you mean why? Because this guy has, this person who writes these articles is a Russian American journalist who was put there specifically with that task. And then we have Telegram. Then we also have Russia paying for articles that originate in like India, China, other countries where they're creating this sort of ecosystem of propaganda and this kind of like, I would even call it an alternate reality. And for people who want to confirm their bias, like with Ukrainian Nazis, when they go online and they Google, is Azov a Nazi battalion, they will find so much proof that they are when they aren't, because of this massive ecosystem that Russia created, both in the journalism world, in the world of high academia, which is wild, in the world of science fiction books and fiction books and nonfiction books. And I think that the world just needs to finally start looking at it as what it is. It's not just propaganda as in like, a light core word for some articles with misinformation. It's propaganda as a massive tool of warfare that has been used in both Ukraine and the West for the past 30 years in a new capacity, and before that for 100.
Yeah, I agree with you. The scale is enormous. For example, according to the data we had in 2017, it's 5 years before the full-scale Russian invasion of Ukraine, Russia spent approximately $4 billion only for external propaganda. It's data according to the Ukrainian Security and Defense Council. $4 billion spent on external propaganda channels like Sputnik, channels like Russia Today, and that's just official data. It's just top of the iceberg because Russia pushes its narratives into everything they produce, into cinematography, music videos, all those cringy books, fantasy books about
Battlefield Sevastopol.
Russians traveling through time, killing Hitler, Bandera, and etc., then returning back. It's oh my god. Luckily, there will be a bit less such literature because one of the authors of a book called "Order to Die," приказ погибнуть, he followed this order. He went to fight in Ukraine, and he basically followed his order.
We love a good self-fulfilling prophecy, you know.
Yeah, absolutely. Karma is a nasty stuff sometimes.
Yeah. Well, you know, this conversation about books also makes me want to mention, as I said priorly, and I feel like we never communicate this enough, right, is that when people think of these operations, they think of something like much larger that they don't come across every day. Like, for instance, like, oh, I don't read the news, so I'm definitely not influenced. Well, here's a fun little fact that I noticed. So as you might know, I've lived in the United States for 13 years until like 7 months ago. So I'm freshly back to Ukraine. And most of my information space was always American TV and American news and American books and things like that, right? And one of the things that I really started noticing very heavily is that we all know that there are always like Russian mafiosi and like, you know, Russian mobs and all of this stuff in all American movies. Anytime there is an adversary of any secret agency, it's always Russians. And and we have those shows like Law and Order, SVU, you know, like just like those kind of like cop shows. And anytime there is a mob, it's always Russians. So since 2014, every single time there was a prostitute that was caught, she was Ukrainian. Any single time there was human trafficking, they were now Ukrainian. Of course, they were speaking broken Russian for some reason, but you know, they were Ukrainian. And they were always from Kiev, which I don't know where that is, but I guess we'll find out. I don't know, because this is Kyiv, but you know, to each their own, I guess. But yeah, it's interesting because, you know, we don't think that these things kind of like touch upon us because we think of them as like, oh, they're in academia. I didn't go to college. Or like, oh, they're, you know, in the news. Oh, I don't read the news. Oh, they're in the newspapers. Oh, I haven't picked up the New York Times since 2010. It's like, no, it's Russian propaganda is so carefully and meticulously integrated into the everyday lives of Western people that you don't even notice it. It's like when you thought of you always thought of Russians as someone bad because in American movies, human traffickers and mobsters were always portrayed as Russians. In 2014, it was not good anymore to portray, you know, Russians as mobsters because now instead of fearing them, you would have a negative impression of them. So what did Russia do? They substituted the movies into Ukrainians. And then you would think like, oh, how do they do that? It's Hollywood. Because there are so many people in Hollywood, in, again, newspapers, academia, everywhere that are not there because they came here for an American dream and made it. They're there because Russia has a conglomerate that puts you where you need to be in order to make these decisions. And I think it starts being quite crazy and eye-opening when you start paying attention to this. And when you watch Law and Order, SVU, and suddenly, you know, there is a human trafficker named Andrei who is from Kiev and who is Ukrainian. And you start noticing that this narrative started changing in order for people to start getting this negative idea of Ukraine about 10 years ago. You live in Germany, right? Or am I mistaken?
Currently, I'm working here with my institute. I'm a reservist. Mm-hmm. So as soon as the order is issued, I will, of course, return back. I have 9 years of fighting on the front lines together with my brigade since 2015. And here in Germany, for example, we also have a lot of good practices, good examples of fighting Russian misinformation. But unfortunately, we also have a lot of examples of Russian misinformation being introduced through all kinds of media.
I was going to ask about that because I usually, sorry for interrupting you. I just want to kind of like give you a direction that I'm very interested in. I usually speak from a perspective of someone who knows a lot about the American info space and the English-speaking info space. I would really want to provide our viewers an insight into what it's like in Germany and how do you see Russian propaganda in daily life in Germany, especially given that Germany was influenced by Russia for a long, long time.
So several of their spies were found in one of the biggest far-right party here. Not all Russian spies. There were also like Chinese spies found there. It's a cringy political movement, actually, just in my opinion. But one thing that I find really interesting about Germany is that you can hear news about Ukraine every single day on the radio, on the television. The reports about Ukraine are coming every single day, which is really, really important. For example, people sometimes text me from places like Canada, United States. They go, "We didn't hear about Ukraine for like weeks."
Yeah.
Even Poland. Yeah, even Poland. But Germany is different, and I can see clear indication that German government clearly understands the threat.
Of course.
Because, again, globally, Putin wants to return all the Soviet territories, Soviet-controlled territories, and unite them with Russia. And this, of course, includes Eastern Germany.
I'm assuming that Germany also has a threat of Russlanddeutsche, right? Which are the lovely Russian people that have been born and raised in Germany since the occupation of Germany and the Soviet Union, and their children and grandchildren. So I would assume that Germany probably sees a lot of issues with that because they're quite taken over by Russians, whether they want it or not.
They have this problem too, but on the other hand, I would say that those people became more assimilated with European society. A lot of them still support Putin, but they were raised here, and they can clearly see the difference. The bigger problem that we can see in this regard is, for example, in Baltic countries, Estonia, Finland, the Russian diaspora there is often, pumped with Russian narratives, Russian hatred. And it can be explained with the fact that Baltic countries are basically neighboring countries. All the Russian neighbors, for some reason I cannot explain, but all Russian neighbors don't really like Russia as their neighbor, like historically, right?
What's there not to like? They're wonderful.
Yeah, amazing people. Musk was criticized, for pushing Russian propaganda, and then his followers and his protectors were like, "Come on, he's giving us freedom of speech. We don't care who funds Twitter, even if it's Russian, but we want our freedom of speech for everyone." And I completely agree on that. ISIS, Taliban, those beautiful Russian terrorists, they all deserve that.
Russia is the kind of neighbor, which just came to me, I think is such a good comparison, is maybe you will know this, but in the United States, there's always like fencing disputes between neighbors. So like you buy a property next to someone, and there is always a neighbor that's going to say, well, like, your fence is like 5 inches into my property. And it's such a stupid thing, because do you really need those 5 inches, And I think that Russia is the kind of neighbor where like you've gone to court, you've shown them where your territory is, and they still want to move their fence 5 inches into your yard because they just have to. And then there's always like the cameras that are pointing not to their house but to your house, and they're watching your every move, and you're just like, what a nightmare, like how did I end up here? And you can't do anything about it. I think that's the kind of neighbor that I guess Midwestern Americans can relate to.
Yeah, that's true. If you take a look at the map of Russia and ask yourself, how did it become like the biggest country in the world, I guarantee it's not because all the territories like Buryatia and Yakutia and Chukotka and other places enjoyed vodka, balalaika, and valenki. It's not because of that reason. The main reason is, of course, because they were conquered, they were captured, and they were assimilated.
Yeah, of course. I mean, especially provided that, all of these, like, let's start from like the most basic vain thing, right? Like none of them look like each other. As in, like, all of these nationalities have their particular looks. They have their particular style. As in, like, if you look back into their traditional clothing or into their languages or into anything, it's these are completely different nations. They were all supposed to have their own borders and, have their own customs and traditions, which they did, but now they don't because they speak Russian and drink vodka and enjoy balalaika because they were told to. But no country on the planet can be this big without taking someone else's land. I guess a good conclusion to this discussion would be, what do you think, in your expert opinion, can we do as everyday people? Because it's good to say, like, what can journalists do and what can governments do, right? But what can your average everyday viewer do in order to help fight this Russian disinformation? Like things like, things on Telegram, things on Twitter, and just generally all of these narratives that we are seeing in the press.
Not much they can do, unfortunately, because you are either a viewer, you are either a consumer of information, or you are a fact checker and freedom fighter. It's either or. As viewers, as information consumers, we never check information, usually, because it's our nature. And it's natural for us to get excited by some incredible news with enormous hype, but not to check the source and things like that. That's why if you really want to fight Russian misinformation, you have to become a fact checker. This is something that you have to do if you want to help fight it. If you want to protect yourself against Russian disinformation, then first of all, consider all Russian sources unreliable. And the reason for that is that there is no freedom of speech in Russia. Whatever Russian media are producing is in accordance to the Russian agenda. That's why what is even the point of accepting this information, right? It's like willingly allowing other to fool you. And of course, you have to check sources, check where this information is coming from. Russians have this, I would say, they have this habit of taking some kind of unknown resource somewhere on the other part of the planet at their main source, and then republish this information in the Russian media, and then from the Russian media it finds its way to the Western media. Always check where this information is coming from. If it's Russia, then consider it as reliable as information coming from like Taliban or sources of ISIS. Yeah, it's the same. It's completely the same.
Yeah, I agree with you on information hygiene and literacy. I think we all need to start practicing it. I guess I would also add, and see if you agree, I think that this war has done something that's really, well, there is nothing really great about a war, but in terms of information has done something really, it's good and bad at the same time. There are lots of Ukrainians who are showing events on the ground and what's happening in Ukraine. There are lots of Ukrainians abroad, diaspora, or people who have moved away a long time ago, who don't necessarily have any access to valid information. They're reading the news the same way as we are. And I think that there are a lot of people who are sort of showing everything that's happening and then taking certain like very loud headlines and spreading them because that's something they're also excited about as a consumer, because they're not people who produce the information for you. They're people who consume it and then retell it to you. So I would also suggest, as much as I love all of our and Western people who are super excited about Ukraine and want to spread information, I would say that also probably a good idea would be to to really reconsider who you are consuming your information from, because there are knowledgeable people with, sources from the military and with sources from sources that come to them because they work in this field. And then there are people who really, really want to help, but end up doing more harm than help, because in reality, they're just, your everyday person who just lives in it and wants to share. So I would say the big part of information hygiene is also really checking your sources. And probably if you see a last name that is Russian in an article, even if it comes from a big American publication, maybe you want to, throw it in the trash or something and not.
The one thing I would like to add is just always remember that Russian PsyOps, their psychological operations, are conducted by Russian military personnel. And of course, all kinds of media can be biased. People say, okay, we will stop watching Russian media, but our media are also biased. Yes, they're biased, but they don't want to kill you. And that is option number one for the Russian military personnel conducting their PsyOps in the Western informational space. That is, again, something to consider.
Yeah, I think in general, a very good thing to sum up here is that, and I know everyone always says this, check your sources, don't fall for propaganda, right? But there are in reality not that many sources that are, no sources are foolproof. You need to make sure that, you need to cross-check and fact-check. And I think, of course, no one wants to do that. But in the global scale of living in the world in which we are living, which is practically, and I wouldn't even argue it, I would just say it directly, we're in World War III. It's just that people imagine World War III as trenches and warfare and what's happening in Ukraine, but everywhere else. But we live in the digital age. World War III is happening on the internet as well, So I think that one of the best things that people can do in order to not fall for, Pavel Durov's Telegram and Elon Musk's Twitter and stuff like that is to really just maybe condense your sources to people that you have consistently seen being able to fact check themselves, being able to admit they were wrong, being able to present you with sources and with good information, and not just sort of satisfy your confirmation bias where when you want Russia to be winning, if you're a person who wants Russia to be winning, you just read sources that are like, yes, Россия вперед, and if you want Ukraine to be winning, you're willing to believe anything, literally, like the idea of Ukraine taking Kursk nuclear power plant in a day, and going.
We all want to believe that, yeah.
Yeah, we want to believe that, but again, it's it's one of those things where these things start flying so fast. It's like Ukraine is on its way to Moscow. No, we're not. We're excited. You're excited. Party in Crimea 2025. Would love to. Not going to happen realistically. So yeah, I would say that's probably a good conclusion. What do you think? Do you have anything to add?
Yeah, we have to stay bold. We have to stay focused. That's the word. Because it's very easy to lose yourself either in depression, get demoralized by Russian PsyOps, or get too excited about things that don't happen in the real life. People's imagination is the greatest, I don't know, the greatest invention of nature. Yeah, it's limitless, and unfortunately, sometimes we fall for the lies that our brain produces to treat ourselves. But we have to stay focused, and we have to fight Russian disinformation together, because there is no other way.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for joining us and sharing your expertise. I guess for everyone who's watching, if you want to make sure that your information is coming from good sources, maybe consider watching Starsky on YouTube. It's an easy transition. You just click in the link that's going to be under this video, and you can go consume your information from good sources. Thank you so much for joining us, and thank you so much for giving us your thoughts. And I will see you guys next time with the next question that sets the internet on fire, because, we live in 2024, as we said, and there are many of those. See ya!